Well, the thing is that we're going to be talking about the incredible amount of bushfires and you know, sort of the wildfires and the things that are happening, particularly in Australia, New South Wales, and other areas which are really absolutely suffering incredibly. Some people would say it's all down to climate change, and some, like Dr. Grady would say, it's got nothing to do with climate change. You know, so are they in denial? Is there good evidence that really this is something that's on the increase? We know that there's been a decade of incredible, intense fires and in different parts of the world, the temperature increasing, etc., etc. Even the ice in the lower hemisphere is losing itself, and it's incredibly disappearing at a fast rate. So, Leslie, you know, as a professor of, you know, sort of climate change, would you? I mean, just as an ordinary person, what would you?
Well, as an ordinary person,
look at all of this.
Well, the way I would look at it is that there certainly is climate change. But I listen to Grady all the time. And Dr. Grady says there's no such thing as climate change. And I kind of do I have a lot of respect for Grady. And so I've kind of poo-pooed it really just on the fact of listening to Grady, because what he says makes a lot of sense. But we're seeing so much change in the climate that I'm finding it hard to
defend a denial basis on it. Yes, I think you and I and probably others are the same. But what Grady would say is that it's cyclical, because you've had warm periods throughout the whole of the history. I mean, there's the Minoan period, and there's the times when the Romans were overrunning the United Kingdom, or England at that time. They never got as far as Scotland. It was probably too cold for them. But there were times there where they had, you know, they were growing grapes and things like that. You've got evidence in the northern parts of England where the hot weather was extremely warm. And certainly when you look through the different periods throughout the latter parts of the, I suppose, what was the mini ice age, which around about the 1700s, which lasted quite a long time. Even the Thames was frozen over. So you've got these extreme weather patterns, and you know, so is it something that's going to come back round again? We could say, right, we go to a lot of expense because of the climate change, which you can't say there isn't climate change. There is climate change, but is it down to pollution? Is it down to man-made pollution? That's the thing what Grady would say is not, because there is more pollution coming from elsewhere than that which we are producing, i.e. from, you know, the cars that we drive and all of that. But
and also young people are really taking up the cause now, and they're saying this is our future, we have to protect our future. And of course you have the activists, the climate change activists, who have had a huge amount of publicity, but they're so desperate to get the message across, because they feel that it's our only hope of saving the planet. I mean, as Christians, we know that one day, and we pray that it's not in the too distant future, that Jesus Christ will be coming back, and therefore it doesn't actually matter. We can't save the planet. It's not our responsibility.
No. First of all, I would say that very last section there, if you look at Revelation chapter 11, I think it is verse 18, it says it is our responsibility. God says he will hold to account those who ruined the earth. And we've never had that potential before in human history, where we are now are in ruining our environment. Whether you look at it as going to be a total disaster or not is a different matter. Like, look at the pollution of the seas, all the plastic in the seas.
True.
Okay, so that's something which is man-made. It's not the fish that made the problem with the plastic bags and all of those sort of things, and the microscopic little parts of the plastics which are now dissipating, but they're getting into the food chain.
So should we be going full force in supporting these climate change activists who are saying, you know, that we've got to more or less, we've got to stop flying on planes, we've got to stop driving cars, we've got to stop eating meat, all of these things.
Well, Grady wouldn't like that one.
No, he wouldn't like that one. If it's our responsibility, then should we be taking far more of an interest in it?
Yeah, I think it's where we can, we should make changes. You know, the thing is that how drastic and how quickly we be making those changes? Well, of course, some of the scientists are saying we have 20, 30 years. Some are even saying if we don't change something in the next 10 years, it'll be catastrophic there'll be no reversal. But yet, when you look at Scripture, you've got scriptures like, for example, in 2 Peter chapter 3, where it talks about that the earth will be, and the elements being intensely hot, will burn up. Well, we're seeing exactly that. If you look at some of the B-roll that we've got of the fires and everything else in New South Wales and everything, these are extreme conditions. You know, is this a fulfillment or the beginning of the fulfillment of 2 Peter chapter 3?
Well, the person who might help us with all of this is Dr. Grady. We do have you on the phone. You don't have any internet, Grady. That's not sounding good, but at least we have telephone connection, yes?
Yes, well, you know, the devil always tries to get in the way, doesn't he?
But we were just talking about climate change, and I was trying to reminisce on the things that you've shared with us in the past. But I suppose, like a lot of our viewers, and even some speculation that we're having ourselves, is that, you know, this does look an extremely sort of urgent matter, that we're seeing all these bushfires and the loss of incredible amounts of animal life. I mean, we're talking 1 billion or more of you know, sacred animals, in that sense, that we've lost them, terrible. Could lose them for good. Let me just carry on as we're talking. Perhaps we could start with Scott Morrison, the Prime Minister of Australia. A couple of video clips. Let's start with him first. You know, Scott Morrison. He's acknowledged the impact of climate change and the bushfires for the last few days, if nothing else, for months. Let's have a look at this.
Do you acknowledge that the bushfires are linked in some way to climate change?
Of course I have. I have all year.
Okay, well, how can you declare it great, our achievements so far, in view of what's happening around the country?
Well, what I'm saying is that Australia is meeting and beating our emissions reduction targets. Even that achievement cannot be directly linked to a reduction or an increase in the risk of bushfire in Australia, because climate change is a global phenomenon. And to actually link those two things, which I don't think it's right to do, as the question sort of implies, I think is to misconstrue it.
Prime Minister, just on climate change, you say it's a global effort, but Australia ranks last in the world on climate policy in a new global index. Isn't that an indictment of your government's response?
No, I completely reject that report. We don't accept that.
You don't accept the report?
No,
we're last in
I
the
don't.
world?
No.
Why not?
Because I don't think it's credible.
It's not credible?
No.
Okay.
Can you tell Australians about what your government is doing to mitigate or to plan for the long-term economic and environmental impacts of climate change over the generation as our children grow up?
Meet and beat our international commitments to reduce our emissions, because that's what a responsible country does.
Is that the only planning that the federal government's doing, just the climate policy settings as they are?
Well, our climate policy settings are to meet and beat our emissions reduction targets. Emissions reduction under our government is 50 million tonnes on average a year less than it was under the previous government, and we want to see the emissions reductions continue in this country, and we want to continue to better the achievements we've already made with measures that achieve that. And that's why our policies are constantly being improved, and the Minister for Energy and Emissions Reduction has already outlined that. He's already flagged that additional measures where they can be put in place will be put in place. But let me be clear to the Australian people. I already have. Let me be clear to the Australian people. Our emissions reductions policies will both protect our environment and seek to reduce the risks and hazards that we're seeing today, and at the same time it will seek to ensure the viability of people's jobs and their livelihoods all around the country. What we will do is ensure that our policies remain sensible, that they don't move towards either extreme, and stay focused on what Australians need for a vibrant and viable economy, as well as a vibrant and sustainable environment. Getting the balance right is what Australia, I think, has always been able to achieve. But right now, the focus, as I said at the outset, is to fight these fires and to get people to safety. That's what we're focused on. That's what the state agencies are focused on. That's what the Commonwealth is doing through the Defence Forces and many of our other agencies, to lend everything that can be done to get that operational response in place, to get help to where it's needed, to get people to places of safety, and to sustain the firefighting effort. Thank you very much.
Okay, we've got Dr. Grady back with us as well, and hopefully on Skype. Dr. Grady, thank you very much for joining us again this evening. It's unusual for you to be at your home and not have a good Wi-Fi or high, a good high signal. But anyway, Grady, I've got to say that there are people, will be saying now, since we last spoke, this situation has become increasingly worrying because Australia just seems to be burning up. And you would obviously say that this is a cyclical event throughout the history where we're seeing all the fires that have been on our screens for the last month or so. Just give us an outline again of where you stand on climate change.
Well, first of all, I'm a very proud climate change denier. Humans are incapable of heating the earth, cooling the earth, incapable of changing climate or even weather other than in a micro-environmental sense. If you are talking about inside a town where heat's increasing because the city or town is increasing in size, that's a micro-environmental thing. But in the macro environment, humans have no control whatsoever over the weather. And as I've stressed before, as a Bible-believing Christian, there's approximately 36 verses in the Bible where God says he's in charge of the weather. We can't change it. Now, let's talk about Australia specifically, because I am deeply concerned about what's going on down there. I mean, the loss of life, the loss of property, the loss of human life, as well as the animal life is incredible. The loss of habitat is incredible. But this is not because of global warming that's occurring around the Earth. What's occurring in Australia, if you really think about it, take a look at the number of arsonists that have been arrested already, and we know there's probably 4 to 5 times as many arsonists as those that have been caught. This is summertime in Australia. This is when we have the children out of school. Half the arsonists that have been caught, approximately, have been juveniles. Now, the heat in Australia is no worse than it has been. As a matter of fact, the mean high temperatures, and I'm using scientific data here, but the mean high temperatures for this time of the year in Australia haven't changed over roughly 120 years. We can take a look at rainfall levels. The rainfall levels have remained stable, roughly. Obviously, it fluctuates every year, but over the long period, the rainfall rates have remained relatively stable for the last 120 years. And we're going back to when basically records were well kept. The fact of the matter is it's not unusual. And if you go back in history, only back to 2009, there were serious fires in Australia. I remember them well myself.
Mike says, surely the question is this regarding climate change. Is it man-made or, there you go. If there's climate change, is it man-made? Also, climate change and pollution are not necessarily the same thing.
Well, that's a good comment, actually. The fact of the matter is that nature pollutes more than human beings, and that's what people forget. But climate change cannot be done by man. And I'll give you an example that nature is actually more of a polluter than humans. One volcano on the Earth can put more particulates and negative gases, if I just sum it up that way quickly, into the atmosphere in 1 year than all the humans on Earth in 1 year.
Well, take, for example, what's happening right now in the Philippines.
Well, you have a minor eruption in the Philippines. You've had one recently in New Zealand. I will classify those as minor eruptions. However, when you take a look at major eruptions, such as Mount Pinatubo in the Philippines in 1991, it's calculated that it put 20 million tons of aerosols and particulates into the atmosphere in 1 year. And because of that, because volcanoes always cool the Earth through their activity, the temperature of the atmosphere of the Earth dropped 0.7 degrees Celsius, 1.3 degrees Fahrenheit in 1 year. Now, when you take a look at Mount Pinatubo, it's a smaller eruption than many of the larger eruptions of the past, such as Krakatoa, Tambora.
Okay. Chris says, hi, Revelation TV. well, he's saying, is climate change cyclical? We spoke about that earlier. In other words, is reducing emissions a bit in vain?
It is totally in vain, and the money that the Australians and the Prime Minister was talking about is being spent for a useless purpose. We cannot control it. And the things that are happening there are, if I can classify it, mostly a man-made catastrophe. It's the arsonists who are taking advantage. And, you know, once one arsonist sees a fire, it then, you know, gets others to participate. And these fires are terrible, but they're mostly man-made.
I did think about that when I was watching some of the television broadcasts last week. I thought, well, how many people are actually going to be had up for arson in all of this, because they could just jump on the bandwagon, as it were. And they seem to have kept quiet about it, you know, because in the past they have spoken about arsonists actually making the situation work in years past.
There are natural fires in Australia. They have what's called dry lightning. And there are natural fires, and there's railroad fires that are caused by human activity. But we know of nearly 200 arsonists that have been arrested already, and you know there's 4 to 5 times that number that haven't been. And we know that nearly half of them were juveniles, and we know how juveniles will do. But the fact of the matter is, once an arsonist starts a fire, other arsonists are then, how should we say it?
Encouraged.
Well, encouraged, I guess, is a mild word of what I was trying to get at. But yes, they're encouraged to start fires of their own, and it just builds and builds and builds, one on top of the other.
Right. Let's stay on the subject of climate change. David says, although we may not be able to change the world's climate, do you believe we can change the local climate? I visited Abu Dhabi, where they have planted millions of palm trees, and the local temperature has dropped by 2 degrees.
And that's why I've talked about the effect of micro-environmental changes. We can affect local things. Now, for instance, the Billy Graham Crusade actually had a program to plant trees in Egypt to try to take back parts of the Sahara, and it was quite successful. Mm-hmm. If you were doing those sorts of things. Now, the problem are the liberal policies. Liberal policies say that nature is equivalent to humans. Therefore, you can't touch nature. It's pristine. You have to leave it alone. But the fact of the matter is that the fires in California and the fires in Australia are from the same thing. Humans preventing the management of nature.
By not clearing the bush?
By not cutting down the fuel supplies, by not building fire breaks. Obviously, there's law enforcement that could be included in that. But there are things that in Australia they are not allowed to do. They are not allowed to build a fire break. They are not allowed to do control.
I did think about that as well, Grady, because over here in Spain, when they have quite bad fires, there are fire breaks that already have put in place so that they can't spread so much. And I'm surprised that Australia and places like California as well haven't made those provisions in the times when it's quite calm.
Well, they were talking about, wise control of the environment. Well, the fact of the matter is what they need to do is wise management of nature. Mm-hmm. We need to build the fire breaks. We need to do the controlled burns, and would prevent this. It is the incorrect policies of the government that have caused this tremendous loss of property, over 2,000 homes. I think the death rate on humans is somewhere up around in the 60s. I don't know I have that number right. But we know like a calculation of 1 billion animals. I think that is absolutely the most horrendous, horrific thing that government has failed.
Well, I've got an email here from Jeff, and in fact, it does tie in with what you were saying. He says, I read a letter in the Daily Express, which is one of our main newspapers, last Wednesday, which related to the fires in Australia. They used to do controlled burning of the undergrowth every 3 years, but this was stopped by the Greens. Interesting, I thought. Thanks for the show. So that does tie in. I've got one here from Marilyn in Wales, and she says, is one of the problems people building homes in places prone to potential disaster areas, i.e. floodplains and bushfire zones, and the ability to film and post disasters over the globe, whereas years ago, even though disasters happened, they were not made public. Let's have a look at this one. Genesis 8, verse 22. Howard, I'm not sure if you could look that up. Does this verse not still apply?
Exactly. You see, that's one of the first verses in the Bible that tells us that humans cannot control the climate or the weather.
Okay.
I'm going to let Howard get it, but it says that after the flood, because of the events of the flood, the things that changed environmentally in the earth because of the flood, the seasons shall now exist and they will continue to exist.
While the earth remains, seed time and harvest, cold and heat, winter and summer, and day and night shall not cease.
And that tells you that humans can't change the weather. There are many other verses. In Amos, it says that God can make it rain on one side of the street and not the other. And those of us who have lived in Florida, and I know that includes you and Leslie,
Yep.
That's absolutely true.
It certainly is. Okay, let's say hi now to Norma. And she says, I do find the extinction groups and Western vegans who advocate stopping eating meat for anything other than health by saying eating less meat will help the environment is hypocritical, as everyone knows that to grow most vegetables, the elements of dried and ground up blood, bone, hoof and bone meal are needed. The more vegetables needed, the more animals are needed to be killed. Yes, there are vegetables grown with chemical cocktails that cause far more damage to the environment. We need to be less wasteful in everything, moderation in all things.
And we should have a balanced diet. We should have a balanced diet, but I would remind you again of Genesis chapter 9, verse 3, where God says, now you shall eat meat, not exclusively, but in combination with vegetation.
Right. Okay. So this was after the flood. So that means that before the flood, the farming would have taken place, and there wouldn't have been any bones and bits and pieces necessarily in the soil at that time, would there?
Well, Howard, remember, animals were used. They were used in sacrifice.
And they still died.
Yeah, but I mean, en masse. I mean, with, you know.
Yeah, they weren't slaughtered en masse.
That particular time, near a time of perfection, you know, the soil would have been very fertile.
It says that the soil loses its fertility because of human sin. And by the time of the flood, and because of the events of the flood, which makes the soil even less fertile, then you have to have the fertilizers after the flood.
Right. Yeah, well, you would have got them by default.
Okay, I've got a comment here. It's a shame that the Australian government doesn't promote more traditional land management. If it did, the bushfires might not be as bad. So that's following what we were talking about earlier. Got another one here. I've got one from Janice, who says the natural things happening on Earth are prophesied in the Bible. The world may call it climate change, and after the rapture, the world may call it alien abduction. What do you think, says Janice?
Well, I think she's made a humorous point.
She has. Next one.
I've got another one here from Carl. Please read this out, Leslie, from Wikipedia. The Black Thursday bushfires were a devastating series of fires that swept approximately 5 million hectares of the state of Victoria, Australia, on the 6th of February 1851. 12 human lives were lost, along with 1 million sheep, thousands of cattle, and countless native animals. The point being that horrific bushfires are nothing new. Would Grady agree, says Carl.
I agree completely. This is nothing but natural, normal cycles made worse by human activity like arson. It has nothing to do with climate change.
Yeah, there weren't many motor cars around that then, were there?
No, and they weren't making many fire breaks back then either.
Yeah.